Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently we are in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and this is of course one of the most famous chapters, the story of David and Goliath, but there's a lot more going on in this chapter. One, we see David being moved into a position in my opinion, to begin to be trained as he is around government, around officials. He's able to see firsthand how government is ran. Now, he's able to also do things in the government. So I think that serves as that treasure. Remember, David is it's probably around the 17-year mark, 16, 17. He won't enter, even though he's been anointed king. It won't be until he's 30 that he will actually take the actual throne. Okay, and of course the other thing is that God through David is going to defeat the Philistines, their gods, and then of course begin to exalt Israel as a nation. David's kingdom, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but David's kingdom will be will be one of the greatest king at the time, the greatest time of the kings of Israel. Okay, the greatest. And anyway, that I'll get more on that as he takes the throne, but this won't be until actually 2 Samuel. So, but from here to the end, we're talking about maybe a 13-year period, and it's going to be rough for David, even though he is anointed king. Saul is going to try to kill him. But all right, let's get to it. 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter. Come on, I'm going to bring this down a little bit. All right, 1 Samuel chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 17. It said the Philistines gathered their forces for war at Succoth in Judah, encamped between Succoth and Azekah, Azekah, and Ephesionim. Sorry again about these names. Anyway, Saul and the men of Israel gathered, encamped in the valley of Eli, and they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines. And the Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on another hill with a ravine between them. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistines' camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall. Now, kind of interesting about Gath. He was just a big dude. All right, he was a warrior. We're going to see this later. If you remember and you kind of go back, you heard the name Gath. You would hear the name Anak, and these were taller men. And Dave, and as we're going to see here, Goliath was this huge man here. All right. Verse 5, and he wore a bronze helmet and a bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. So, there was the bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze sword was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. Now, you see this picture of the ultimate warrior. I mean, in other words, not only this guy huge and big, and later we're going to see that he was a warrior from his youth. His massive size, he was trained, so he was big, strong, and the idea is undefeatable. Okay. Verse 8, he stood and shouted to the Israelites, battle formation. Why do you come out to line up in battle formation? He asked them, am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have them come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servant. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. Then the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other. And when Saul and all of Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Right? In other words, now David was the son of a Ephrathite, Ephrathite from Bethlehem of Judah, named Jesse. Now Jesse had 8 sons. During Saul's reign was already an old man, Jesse's 3 eldest sons had followed Saul to war, and their names was Eliab, and the firstborn Abinadab, and the next Shammah, and the third, and David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David kept going back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock in Bethlehem. Now, remember, Samuel had anointed David king. His brothers saw that, but he is just still a regular guy. Saul kind of brought him into his service as his lie player, string, just to soothe him. Verse 16, every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistines came forward and took his stand. And on one day, Jesse told his son David, take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Also take 10 portions of cheese to the field commander. Check on the welfare of your brothers and bring a confirmation from them. They are with Saul and all of the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David got up early in the morning, left the flocks with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had instructed him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to his battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Now, in reality, they were scared as I don't know what. Verse 21, Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation facing each other. David left his supplies in care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. And when he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. And while he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. And when all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. Previously, an Israelite man had declared, do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and will give him his daughter. The king will also make his household of that man, father, exempt from paying taxes in Israel. Now, with all of that, because as you all know, paying taxes is a drag. They still wouldn't take the bait because they figured, well, it's not going to benefit me if I'm dead. They were terrified of Goliath. Verse 26, David spoke to the men who were standing with him. What would be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes his disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people told him about the offer, concluding this is what will be done to the man who kills him. Now, again, interesting, later on, David will marry his Saul's daughter. Verse 28, David's oldest brother Eliab listened as he spoke to the men and became angry with them. Why do you come down here? He asked him, why do you leave those few sheep with the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You've come down to see the battle. So now David is kind of, what's interesting to me about this is that he saw that the prophet had anointed him. So I don't know if jealousy is at play here, right here. Or if he's just a big brother bossing his little brother around. Okay. Verse 29. What have I now done? David protested. David, it was just a question. Then he turned from those beside him to the others in front of him and asked about the offer, and the people gave him the same answer. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul. So, I'm sorry, I think I missed something here. All right. They said what David said was overheard. Verse 31 again. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, so he had David brought to him. David said to Saul, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. But Saul replied, you can't go and fight the Philistine. You're just a youth. And he has been a warrior since he was young. Now, let me stop because reading this can almost seem confusing. David had access to Saul because he played the flute. And really that was extended to it, that really Saul did not, or probably didn't pay attention at all, because David was seen just as any other servant. Okay. Now the reason why I say that, because you're going to see in a few minutes how Saul's going to act like he don't know who he is, right? And again, partially that's true, other than saying, okay, I've seen him around. He plays the flute, and when he plays the flute, I feel good. Okay. Verse 33. But Saul replied, you can't fight against this Philistine. You are just a youth, and he has been a warrior since he was young. David answered Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or bear came and carried off the lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from his mouth. If he reared up against me, I would grab him by his fur and strike him down and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Then David said, the Lord will rescue me from the paw of the lion, and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. Now you'll remember when David was anointed, and this could have even happened before then, but for sure, when David was anointed king, the Bible said the Spirit of the Lord would come on him. So now we can see why David would do these great, he would defend himself going up against a bear and a lion, two of the most, of course, strongest animals on the planet. Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Verse 38, then Saul had his own military clothes put on David, and he put on a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. Now you also remember that David at one point was Saul's armor bearer. Verse 39, David strapped his sword over his military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. I can't walk in these, David said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. Instead, he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his pouch, in his shepherd bag. Then, with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. The Philistine came closer and closer to David, with the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him, because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, am I a dog that you come out against me with sticks? Then he cursed David by his gods. Come here, the Philistine called to David, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. So he says, I'm just going to feed you to the birds, right? Verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a dagger, spear, and a sword, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's army. you have defiled him. Today the Lord will hand him over to me. Today I will strike you down, cut off your head, and give the corpse of the Philistines' camps to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. Then all of the world will know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. So again, this story is such a great champion. Keep this in mind, though. This is God's doing. Okay. Now, the reason why I say that, because sometimes I hear people take stories like this and say, see, just have enough faith and, and God will give you battles like Goliath and all that kind of stuff. And while that's true to a certain point, understand that this particular battle is because God decreed that God's sovereignty was involved here. That God was showing himself strong against the Philistine, and also exalting David. Verse 48. When the Philistines started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and slung it, and hit the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. And David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Even though David had no sword, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from his sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that the hero was dead, they ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah rallied, shouting their battle cry. They chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley, to the gates of Ekron. And the Philistines' bodies were strewn along the Sharam road to Gath and Ekron. And when the Philistines returned from the pursuits of the Philistines, they plundered their camps. And David took Goliath's head and brought it to Jerusalem. And he put Goliath's weapon in his own tent. And when Saul had seen David going out to confront the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commanders of the army, "Whose son is this youth, Abner?" "My king, surely, as you live, I don't know," Abner replied. The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." And when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head still in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" "The son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem," David answered. Now, as I said before, remember, even though David was kind of in the courtyards with Saul, Saul probably, like I said, did not pay any attention to him. In other words, he saw him, but he probably saw him just as a servant, and thus his thing was, he was a nobody. In other words, just like any other slave or servant. But by killing the greatest hero of the Philistines, of course now everybody knows who David is. And as I said, it served two purposes of God. One, to exalt David in the eyes of the people, and then also to bring glory to God and defeat the Philistines and their gods. So now, this should have been a victory, glorious times, but it get worse for David for the next 13 some years. All right, guys, chapter 18 in the next study. I'll see you then.